everybody, and welcome back to the FPL Family YouTube channel. I'm Sam, and today we are going to be taking another deep dive, this time into the Foxes and Leicester City. Now they, for me, were one of the sides that were a little bit disappointing last season, and that in part wasn't their fault. They had so many injuries. They had some players that were on fantastic runs of form and then had major injuries. They started the season with players with major injuries, and of course they had some difficult issues towards the back end of the season as well. Yet again, another season where Leicester City really should have made the Champions League, and yet again finished just short of being able to do that. Now, going into the new season, of course, they'll be looking at the Europa League with optimism. The last time they played in the Europa League in the previous season, back in 2021, they were knocked out in the round of 32 to Slavia Prague. Disappointing, actually, that was, because they first of all went away to Slavia Prague, drew that game 0-0, and then lost the home tie 2-0, meaning they went out at a much earlier stage than I think most of us who watch Leicester City in the Premier League week upon week were anticipating. I certainly thought that Leicester City were going to go a lot further in that competition than they did, but in part that led for less rotation in the Premier League, and it maybe led to more commitment and better results in the Premier League because they weren't having to split themselves. Now, when you look at players like Jamie Vardy, of course, Jamie Vardy is not necessarily, a spring chicken anymore. He is 34 years old, playing 2 games in a week regularly over the course of the season. If they manage to stay in the Europa League for longer this time around, just doesn't, for me, feel like something that Vardy is going to be able to sustain. And maybe that's why they have brought in their new signing, who we'll talk about a little bit later on. Now, when we have a little look at the stats for this season, there are some really good underlying stats across this Leicester City side. So Vardy was 3rd for XG underachievers across the course of the season, and 2nd for BPS across the forwards in the game. Of course, he was beaten by Harry Kane. Tielemans was the one that really surprised me, actually, with his underlying stats. In most cases, he has really nice underlying stats for the 2021 season. He was 5th for touches in the opponent's half, managing 1,731 in total across the course of the season. In fact, he made 3,151 touches across the Premier League last season, which is a phenomenal number of touches on the ball. And of course, that then means that he regularly racks up the BPS, meaning that he finished 5th for BPS amongst midfielders last time out. He also seems to be on penalties when Jamie Vardy isn't on the pitch. Leicester City had 10 penalties last season. That was the joint highest in the Premier League, of course, with Manchester United also getting given 10. Leicester City managed to score theirs, 8 of them for Jamie Vardy and 2 of them for Tielemans when Vardy wasn't on the pitch. Other things that were interesting to note there, indeed, he was 4th for touches across the division. 4th for tackles across the division. He made 136 tackles, of which he won 96 of them. So again, some really good underlying stats there. And those things are really going to help with those additional bonus points that we all look for across our FPL assets. When we look at the goals that scored last season, Leicester City managed 68 goals across the Premier League. That was the 3rd best in the league, level with Spurs, and Liverpool tied level with those guys. They were also tied 3rd with Chelsea for goals scored from inside the box, managing 53 of them across the Premier League season. So very good stats inside the box for Leicester City. Of course, the rest of them coming then from outside of the box. When we have a little look then at the big chances, they scored 41 big chances, which was the 4th biggest number in the league. And as I've mentioned about penalties, again, having the most penalties across the division. Where they did come up a little bit short last season was for set pieces, only managing 6 goals from set pieces last season, which was the 3rd worst in the Premier League. Again, that's a disappointing stat, but when you couple that with all the good stuff that we've just been talking about, it makes their options look attractive. They were also averaging a chance every 7.4 minutes last season, and they had a really good goal conversion rate. Only Spurs had a better goal conversion rate than Leicester City last season. So again, movements in the right direction, the underlying stats looking promising for them. When we have a little look defensively though, only 11 clean sheets last season. That was the 11th best in the league, level with Burnley and West Ham. Slightly disappointing from a defensive perspective, but there were a lot of key injuries at the back for Leicester last season. Let's have a little look then at these goals. 68 of them, as I mentioned. My thanks once again, as always, to our friends at Fantasy Football Scout for letting us use the members area data in these videos. The heat maps that you can see on the screen at the moment, alongside all the tables that you're going to see across the course of this video, all come from there. And Fantasy Football Scout have a new members area launching this summer, which is, I've had a little play with it, really, really good. And the fact you can see your live ranking there, I'm really looking forward to next season. If you aren't an FF Scout member and you would like to be, you can get 20% off in the description below by using our sign up link. So these heat maps that we have on screen then, the first one shows the 68 goals that Leicester City scored over the course of the season. You can see how many of them came from inside the box by that sheer number of little yellow balls in that penalty box area. And then the second one shows all of the attempts on goal. The green ones are the ones that eventually ended up on target. Now, staying with goals then for a moment, this shows the XG that Leicester City had across the course of the side. So we can see Jamie Vardy sat there nice and pretty at the top, followed by Iheanacho and Harvey Barnes, who obviously missed the back end of last season through injury, and Tielemans. So we have some decent underlying stats there, particularly from Jamie Vardy, who managed to score 15 goals across the season. That was the fourth best amongst the forwards in the game. Nacho managed 12 goals, which was the tied seventh best across the division. So there was a significant difference between what Vardy did and what Iheanacho did last season, but then there was also a huge difference and a huge discrepancy in the number of minutes that the pair of them managed. And of course, a huge discrepancy going into this season in terms of the prices that you're going to need to pay for Vardy and Iheanacho. There is a lot of difference. That 3 million makes the world of difference when you're looking at whether you should invest or not in these options. Vardy was second amongst forwards for assists last season with 9. Only Kane had more than him with his 14. He was also second for XG amongst forwards across the entire game. So there is some really good underlying stats for Jamie Vardy. It's just whether he's really worth that premium price tag that he's got on his head for this coming season. Nacho was 4th for XA, above Jamie Vardy, in fact, who was 6th. So when you're looking at the underlying stats, you've got more in the way of goal threat from Vardy and, of course, more potential upside because he is their penalty taker. But Nacho has more ability to make assists and, of course, didn't play as much last season. So if we see more consistency of starts from him in 21-22, we could see actually that he becomes much better value for money than his more expensive counterpart. Of course, we do have to add in the third striker in Daka, who we'll talk about a little bit later. And of course, that's going to change the dynamics in terms of that Leicester City attack. Harvey Barnes then, he was the highest scoring Leicester City midfielder across the course of the season. He got 9 goals, which was the 15th best in the Premier League, 1 more than teammate Maddison and 3 more than Tielemans, who was the next best in the list of the Premier League across the midfield. Barnes was also top amongst Leicester mids for penalty area touches, managing 102 over the course of last season, so was getting in all the right places. Now, as I mentioned before, did of course get injured in the back part of last season, and therefore what happens with him going into the new season could be important, and it could make an important difference to what happens up top as well, because Iheanacho tended to play in the absence of Harvey Barnes. So it is something that we do kind of need to consider when we're looking at the Leicester City options and whether Iheanacho is worth the money. Maddison was top for Leicester midfielders for goal attempts. He had 75 goal attempts, which was the 7th best across the Premier League, more than the likes of Sterling, more than Son, more than Rafinha. So of all of the attacking options that Leicester City have, Maddison and Tielemans kind of standing out with Harvey Barnes. If he'd have stayed fit, I think would have been up there and probably would have exceeded both of those in terms of what he was doing going forward last season. Things that we have on screen now, we have our set piece threats then. So as you can see, Maddison at the top of set piece threats with 16, followed quite closely actually by Tielemans and Fofana, who continues actually, I was going to say stood out, but continues to stand out because of his price tag going into next season. Fofana was unbelievable, particularly during Ramadan when he was fasting and still playing at such a phenomenal pace. So Fofana, I think, could be a really nice option in that Leicester City defence. But going forward, we had some good set-piece threat, but as we mentioned earlier, they just weren't converting that threat that they had into goals from set pieces, just the 6 across the course of the season. And then we've got penalty area touches in the final third, and as I mentioned earlier, Tielemans sitting top of that list, followed by Maddison and Barnes. So they're all getting into the right places. It's just which of them you want to invest in for the coming season. All right, let's have a little look at some of these Leicester City picks then in more detail. So we've already talked about Jamie Vardy. He sits top there of the list that's sorted by the number of points that they scored last season. Now, of course, Jamie Vardy, as mentioned before, is 34 years old. Leicester City have now signed Daka, who I'll talk about again shortly, but he looks to be potentially the long-term replacement for Jamie Vardy. What impact he has going into the 21-22 season remains to be seen in terms of the minutes that Vardy and Iheanacho get. However, you would expect that there will be some limitations to Jamie Vardy going into this season, simply because, as I mentioned before, the Europa League commitment, and we now have another forward in the game at Leicester City who potentially might limit Jamie Vardy's game time. I'm not expecting there to be an immediate change in how much Jamie Vardy plays. Absolutely not. But could we see him being withdrawn early in some matches to enable him to play more minutes in the Europa League? Absolutely, yes, I think we can. Let's be frank, Brendan Rodgers is going to want to fight properly on both fronts, and therefore we just might see a few minutes of Premier League time shaved off of Jamie Vardy, particularly given his age. 34 is quite old for a forward. When we have a little look down this list then, we'll have a little chat about Schmeichel, who sits there in 4th place for points scored across the Leicester City side. He made 88 saves last season, which sounds a lot, but actually wasn't really. It was 14th among goalies for the number of saves he made across the season. He conceded 50 goals though, which was better, was 7th best amongst goalies, and kept 11 clean sheets, which was 5th best among goalies. Now I'm going to be having a look at Schmeichel in more detail in a goalkeeper video that's coming up on the channel shortly, so he's one to have a little look at. But for me, there are some cheaper 4.5 options who I think offer more in the way of potential for goalkeeper picks for this coming season. Fofana, I've already mentioned, he was top for aerial duels across the Leicester side, making 148 of them. Although Johnny Evans next to him did have a better conversion win percentage rate of his aerial duels, managing 71.9% success rate in aerial duels, whereas Fofana's was just 59.5%. One other thing I should have said about both Tielemans and Schmeichel is that both of them were the only players to start every game for Leicester City last season. So in terms of rotation, you can see that there is some there definitely across the rest of the side, but in part that was due to the number of injuries that Leicester had last season. Let's have a look at the new boy then, Daka. He signed from Red Bull Salzburg, coming into FPL at 7.5 million. Unsurprised by his price, to be honest, because it makes sense for him to be priced alongside Iheanacho. Last season, he managed a goal every 72 minutes, and in total across the Austrian Bundesliga, he made 28 league appearances. He scored 27 goals across those appearances and made 7 assists, making him the top scorer across the Austrian Bundesliga, and also he was the league's player of the season last year. Now, of course, we do have to bear in mind that things are slightly different in the Austrian Bundesliga to in the Premier League, and so there will be some discrepancies when we look at his data against the Premier League data. What I will say, though, is his international manager has spoken about him in the same context as the likes of Samuel Eto'o and also Sadio Mane. He said, I would say he's on the road to replace what Samuel Eto'o once was in representing Africa and African football. He could be compared to Sadio Mane or Eto'o with the level of skill and speed he has. So promising conversations coming out of his international camp there also. Across all competitions last season, Daka managed 34 goals, 12 assists in 42 appearances. His goal ratio has improved over the last couple of seasons. It has gone up between the 2019-20 season and the 2020-21 season. We're yet to see if he'll be able to continue that in the Premier League or if he gets enough minutes to continue that in the Premier League. But he's heading in the right direction. Shots per 90 then again, that's improved on season. He was gone from 4.23 to 4.63 respectively, and shots on target has roughly stayed the same, 2.31 to 2.21, so not a huge amount of difference there, but is getting in the right places, making them. Now, when we have a look at that in comparison to some of the guys that we have on screen at the moment, in comparison to the likes of Vardy and Nacho and Maddison and Tielemans, that compares really well. It even compares really well when you look at him against Harry Kane. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We need to remember that the Austrian Bundesliga and the shots you get and your ability to convert those shots in the Bundesliga is going to be entirely different to in the Premier League. And so Daka does have a lot to live up to in terms of whether he can continue that. Now, as I've mentioned already, Vardy is 34 now. He'll be 35 during the course of the next Premier League season. Can he realistically play twice in a week? If he can, great, but I'm not convinced he can. What happened in terms of Nacho's game time? We saw it increase when Vardy was injured. We saw it increase when Harvey Barnes was injured. But when we get to a point where Barnes is back and Maddison's fit and Perez is fit and Didi's fit, Tielemans is fit, and we have all of these players available, how much game time is there for two forwards? Or do Leicester City go back to playing one up top? If they go back to one up top, we might have problems in terms of getting enough minutes for Vardy and Nacho and Daka. So for me, I'm hard avoiding that Leicester City front line, not because I don't think that they could be worth investment, but because I don't see how they're going to share those minutes out just yet. That's something I'm waiting and watching on next season. For me, it's Fofana at the back that I'm looking at from a Leicester City point of view. He's cheap, his price point is ideal looking at rotating options, and if you saw the rotating pairs video, you'll have seen that Fofana can be a good rotating pair. Also, other players that we're looking at for next season, for me, Harvey Barnes is on my list of players that I'm keeping an eye on, and when he eventually returns from his ACL injury, James Justin is going to be another one. Now, Brendan Rodgers said in February when his injury happened, we're expecting him to be out for about 9 months. That would see him coming back into the game in around November time. So he'll be one I'm keeping an eye on. Leicester City, I think, have the potential to be really good FPL assets this season. We just have to monitor them in terms of who's getting game time, because there's a lot of them now across the Premier League and the Europa League commitments. That's it. We'll be back next time with a look at Liverpool. Well, actually, it'll be Lee who's back with a look at Liverpool. So make sure that you hit that subscribe button so you get notified every time we go live and release a video on our channel. Drop me a like and let me know in the comments which Leicester City assets you'll be looking to ahead of the 21-22 season. Thanks, guys.